All right, so we're going to be just looking to start at this first paragraph right here. Okay, and if this is a little bit small, feel free to kind of just pay attention to it on your own screens too. But let's kind of just give this a quick listen.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
Okay, so that's our first paragraph. And I think one of the first things I like to point out about this one is the speed. Notice that he speaks this super, super slowly. And I think this is a place where like a lot of people learning English would kind of fly through this. They would say this maybe in like 3 seconds. But he's taken about 5, 6, 7 seconds just to say this whole line. So that's the first thing I want you to kind of pay attention to. Now, when we're analyzing this paragraph, the first thing that we want to pay attention to is something called thought groups. Now, if you've seen my intonation video or videos, you'll know that we kind of break things up. We're trying to identify places where native speakers will pause, even very, very slightly. So let's kind of play this again, just kind of identify where we think he's pausing. Where is this happening?
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic,
Okay, so I'm hearing a couple different pauses. Like at the beginning of the slight pause, coronavirus, pause, pandemic, pause. And then
you got really, really mad at me
you got, pause, really, really mad at me. Pause after me.
that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
And then I'm hearing two thought groups here. That I kept going into work, pause, hospice and palliative care, pause. Okay, so these are the places where I personally identified a pause. Okay. And there's, with thought groups, part of what can make this difficult for people learning English is that there is variety to this. Every single person has their own personal style to how they want to pause. Every person in different contexts is going to pause in different places. So if I'm really excited, I'm probably going to pause more often. All these different factors are really affecting how often I'm going to pause. So that's kind of the first thing that you want to do. You want to identify places where speakers are pausing. Okay, this is how you can do this type of analysis on your own. Okay, so I'm going to display that paragraph one more time so you can hear those pauses again.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
Okay, so those are all my pauses. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to identify stress. In every thought group that you find, one word is going to be stressed. When we say stress, what we mean is the pitch is going to be held. The pitch is actually going to be a little bit higher. Let's play that first thought group really quick to demonstrate.
At the beginning of the
So you can hear them at the beginning. It's like the g at the beginning. That's going to be our stress. You can hear him raising the pitch there. That's indicating it's a stress. Words that do not get stressed typically are going to be said a little bit faster. So kind of pay attention to how he's going to say at the end of the. Let's just kind of listen to that again really quick.
At the beginning of the
notice that again at the said super fast. At the beginning of the. All right. So I'm going to play the rest of this. And then what I want you guys to do, I want you to kind of identify words that are going to be stressed. Some of this is kind of already done for you. So for instance, coronavirus will get a stress because it's the only word in that thought group. Pandemic will get a stress because it's the only word in that thought group. So I want you to pay attention to the you got, the really, really mad at me, what word gets stressed there, that I kept going into work, what word gets stressed there, and to hospice and palliative care. See if you can identify the stresses in these other groups. Okay, I'm going to play the audio. I will play it 2 times. I want you guys to find the stresses.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
I'm going to play that again. Again, find the stresses in those thought groups.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
Okay. You guys can unmute yourselves. Tell me, what do you think are some of the words that are being stressed here? If anyone is feeling particularly brave. If you don't want to say it out loud, you can also put it in the chat box too.
Inning,
Uh-huh.
coronavirus,
Mhm.
really, going.
Which really did you have the stress for?
First one,
First one? First one. I'm hearing consensus for the first one. Okay.
God. You got.
Uh-huh. So stressing the guy already. Okay. How about in that last thought group?
Hospice. Care.
So, okay. I'm glad actually you said that. So, when you're talking about thought groups, you can have multiple stresses, but one stress is always going to be heavier. So if you had to choose in that last thought group between hospice and care, let's play that one more time. I want you guys to listen. Which gets the heavier stress, hospice or care?
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
What do you think? Hospice or care for the last thought group?
Care.
care.
2 votes for care. Care. Any dissenters? Anyone disagree?
Hospice.
Still a vote for hospice? So let's talk briefly about stresses. So words that can be stressed. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. These are the most common words that are stressed. There are other words that you can stress as well, but these are the most common. Okay, just to start with that. Now, in a sentence, in a general sentence where nothing unusual is being stressed, the strongest stress is going to typically fall towards the end of the thought group. Okay, so if I have a thought group here with the hospice and palliative care, the slightly heavier stress is most likely going to be on care. Now, that's not to say that if you put the stress on hospice, there's not a huge problem with that because hospice does get some stress. I don't really have an issue if you put a stress on hospice. But technically, the heavier stress would probably be on care. Also, note how he says care. I just want to listen to how he says that last word.
Really mad at me that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
Okay. So this is something that you can apply to your own speech immediately and start sounding more native-like. For the last word, if the last word is stressed, hold it longer. If your last word of a sentence is stressed, you want to hold it a little bit longer because it's the end of your sentence. It's the word that gets the heavier stressed. This is something that can immediately make you sound more native-like if you just hold it. So if you said like hospice and palliative care, like it's a little bit fast. But if you say the hospice and palliative care, no, so I'm just adding like an extra millisecond or 2 or 3, but it immediately makes it sound a little stronger. Okay. You got. I also want to take a listen to that you got again one more time. I'm just going to play that again.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really.
It's like you got. I personally almost hear a heavier stress on you. But I think if you put it on got, I wouldn't necessarily say that's wrong. I think also, always think about context with stress. Stress can change. Even words that aren't in this list about nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, even other words can be stressed too. Like articles like the could be stressed, in certain situations and things like that. For me, by placing the stress on you, it's like really emphasizing this other person that he's talking to. Like you got really, really mad at me. Like just adds a little bit of emphasis on that. The other place where I personally felt like I heard the stress was on work. Like that I kept going into work. We'll play that again.
Really, really mad at me that I kept going into work.
Like that I kept going into work. That I kept going. I do think going receives stress. I would say going for me gets like the second heaviest stress. But for me, work gets a slightly heavier one. That I kept going into work. That I kept going into work. Just holding that just a little bit longer. So again, regardless, does anyone have any questions for me about thought groups? Does anyone have any questions for me about stress? I'll wait like 5 seconds just to see if anyone does. Really quick, Mohammed, if you're telling me something, you got to unmute yourself really quick. You can say hello.
Hello, teacher. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for joining us, man. So we've
Yeah,
talked.
I'm a little late.
Great. We've already talked about thought groups. We've talked about stress. So the next thing that we're going to talk about, and again, in terms of doing analysis on your own with material, the next thing that I want you to focus on, intonation. For intonation, and I know my handwriting is horrible, so my apologies. When we talk about intonation, if you're not familiar with intonation, we're talking about rising intonation and we're talking about falling intonation. To give you an example, rise, rise, that's rising intonation. Fall, fall, that's falling intonation. One of the things that separates English from a lot of other languages is the intonation is constantly changing. There's a lot more movement in intonation in English than there is in other languages. For instance, Romance languages tend to be very flat. Okay, just to give an example with Italian, because that's what I have the most familiar with. In general, in Italian, I know Italian sounds like it goes up and down a lot, but in the actual language, your goal is to try to stay pretty flat until the end of your sentence. You'll rise if it's a question, you'll fall if it's the end. Other languages that are pretty flat, same thing for like Spanish, Russian is pretty flat. Same thing for Ukrainian as well. So this is a big difference between English and those languages. So we're going to listen to this. And when I say intonation, we're going to be paying attention to the last word. Okay. So for instance, what's the intonation for the? What's the intonation for coronavirus? What's the intonation for pandemic? What's the intonation for got? Basically, all the last words of every thought group tell me, do you think it's rising or do you think it's falling? Okay. I'm going to play this audio. Let's just look at the first one really quick together. A slightly different color.
At the beginning of the
So at the beginning of the, to me that's a rise. At the beginning of the, let's play that again.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic.
Coronavirus, risk to me is a rise. Pandemic, fall. So at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, let's now play the rest of this, and I want you to try to mark it off. Okay, so tell me, what do you think is intonation for got, for me, for work, and for care? Let's play that again.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
I'm going to play that one more time. Then I'm going to ask you guys what you think the thought groups are.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
Okay. So how about for got? Do we think got is rising or falling? You can unmute yourselves and let me know what you think.
Rising.
Falling.
The battle begins. Is it rising or falling? Oh no. Okay. So we'll take a look at that one again. How about the me? Rising or falling?
Falling.
Falling.
Falling. Is that consensus? Okay. So I'm hearing falls. How about work? Work. Falling or rising? What do you think?
I thought it was like flat. Like no, not falling, not free.
This is just a flat, okay. Just kind of staying put, okay. Other thoughts? How about for care? Nothing. Stumped us. All right. Well, I'm going to listen to this and let's kind of see what my personal thoughts are.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic.
So again, just to recapitulate on this, at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. Fall. And our next part.
You got
You got. So is it got or is it got? You got or you got or you got? To me, I think it's more of a fall.
Okay.
That's great. Yeah, I would personally say a fall. Let's take a look at that me next.
really, really mad at me.
You got really, really mad at me. The me is reduced. It's a little bit hard to hear because it's so fast. But to me, I'm getting a fall on that. So I'd agree with the fall. And next, I heard a flat for work. So let's see what we think.
That I kept going into work.
That I kept going into work. That I kept going into work.
Yeah, it's falling.
I would call that a fall. There are cases, where there is going to be relatively flat, but I would say when you're doing this on your own, try to make a decision between rising and falling, because typically for the last word of a thought group, it's going to have some sort of movement, even if it's very slight. Try to make a choice if you can. And how about our last one for care?
To hospice and palliative care.
To hospice and palliative care. To hospice and palliative care. And I think this one's actually really interesting because for me, I'm hearing two. I think it starts with a rise, care, and it ends with a fall. Care. To hospice and palliative care. To hospice and palliative care. Okay. Eliza, if you're telling me something, can you unmute yourself really quick? Hospice and palliative care. Yeah, so to me and this type of pattern is actually really, really common in English. Okay, so this is something I'd really like you to begin paying attention to when you're listening to things, because people do this type of fall rise or rise fall in like one word, one syllable. Relatively common. This is a pretty common structure that you'll see in English. Okay, and it is something that can, again, it's one of those things that once you start doing it, it can immediately make you sound a little bit more natural. It immediately makes a difference. Okay, so those are, when I'm looking at analysis of paragraphs or conversations, these are all the things I do. These are all the steps. We start off with thought groups. We then find the stresses. We then find the intonation. Okay, let's listen to this one more time. One more time.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me. That I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
Okay. What I'd like you to do now, you can do it on your own, or if you're feeling brave, you can unmute yourself. Let's just kind of say what we just heard. So this is how you can take your speaking to the next level. Okay, so you've done the analysis. Now is the time to, if you have a recorder, take out your recorder, record yourself saying the same sentence, and then compare. You can use all the notes that you just made. So for instance, if I wanted to read this and I want to try to sound just like him, it's like, at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me that I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care. Okay. And again, this is the goal. Why are we doing all this analysis? To help you with your speaking. So this is how you improve with your speaking. You record yourself and then you make some notes. You try to find the differences. You can say, oh, I rose here. I needed to fall here. Or, oh, I said this too fast. That's another thing I'd like you to pay attention to is speed. So note how long it takes them to do all this. So like if this takes him 10, 15 seconds to read, then your goal is to try to read it in 10 to 15 seconds too. And I think what you're going to find is that you probably read it a little bit faster than he does. So as a quick little bonus thing right now, let's kind of look at speed. Let's talk about the places where we think he goes fast and the places where we think he goes slow. Okay, so I'm going to play this whole first paragraph again. I want you to tell me the places where he goes the fastest. I want you to tell me the places where he goes the slowest. Let's play it again.
At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you got really, really mad at me. That I kept going into work to hospice and palliative care.
Where are the places where he goes the fastest?
At the beginning,
So at the beginning,
he
I'll say,
starts faster and then slower.
uh-huh, uh-huh. So I'll say at the beginning, yeah, I'll say that first part. He goes pretty quick. Definitely goes pretty quick. Other places where he goes a little faster,
Really, really mad at me.
that's interesting. So I was gonna say is that notice how he says. Notice how you just said really, really mad at me, and notice how he says really, really mad at me. Let me play that again if I can find it.
Pandemic, you got really, really mad at me.
So I would say like for the mad at me, I would say he speeds up there. But notice on the really, this is a place where people learning English tend to fly. They'll say like really, really mad at me. But notice what he's doing. He's saying really, really mad at me. Really, like how many seconds is that? Really, really. He's taking like 3-4 seconds just to say those two words. And a lot of people studying English, learning a second language, they're going to say that in like 2 seconds. So he's like adding 50 to 100% onto the speed. Okay. So that's another thing that I really want to emphasize is that speed's super important. If you're exaggerating something, if you're describing something, you want to make it sound more dramatic. Slow it down. Just slow it down. Instead of saying it in 1 second, say it in a second and a half, 2 seconds. I'm not saying you have to make it like 10 seconds. You don't have to say like really, really. That's a little too much. But if you normally say like really, really, making it like really, really, something like that, to a native speaker, it's going to sound pretty good. Okay, guys. That's pretty much what I had for today. I know we only got through one little paragraph. However, I hope that this at least kind of gives you the tools that you need to kind of start analyzing your own speed and your own intonation and practice and everything like that for getting your speaking better. Questions, comments for me about anything that we covered today?
Yeah, I have one question. Why do you think this happened? Like, why do you think people tend to speak faster?
I mean, I think when people learn a language, they, especially like for advanced level students, we're talking about, most of you I've communicated with, and I would say you're pretty advanced level students. I think there's this like fear of being associated with other language learners that people don't like. Like there's like they want to seem more advanced. I think it's like a tool that like, oh, like native speakers speak quickly, so I'm going to speak quickly. I think it's also a lack of understanding about stress or the importance of stress. English is a stress time language. A lot of people learning English, though, are coming from syllable time languages. Like if you're coming from a Romance language, like if you're coming from like Spanish or Portuguese, you're stressing syllables. You're not paying as much attention to stress. And in English, it's the opposite. Stress is super, super important. If you don't have stress, your sentences aren't going to sound good. I mean, that's just reality. So those would be my thoughts on why do people learning English or who learned English tend to speak a little bit faster. I would say those are the reasons why. And also because like some native speakers do speak faster than others. So it could be that the things that you're used to listening to, the speakers speak faster.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Other quick questions, comments for me?
Teacher, so how does it take to sounds like a native speaker?
Like, how do these things make you sound like a native speaker? Is that the question? I mean, I think that because what tends to happen is that people aren't paying enough attention to this. If you're just focusing on pronunciation of words, that's only really half the battle. You can have perfect pronunciation, but if your intonation is horrible, or if you are stressing every syllable instead of stressing specific words, people are not going to have an easy time understanding you. To give you an example, a typical accent that can be hard for people to understand are accents that come from India. So like Hindi accents, Bengali accents. Why is it more difficult to understand people who have those types of accents? Well, because intonation pattern is completely different. Intonation pattern is completely different. English, again, is stress timed. What typically happens for speakers coming from India and surrounding countries like that is that every single syllable has about the same stress, and that it affects your ability to understand. English speakers, they're looking for, again, stress. They're looking for intonation. If you use rising intonation where you need to use falling intonation, or if you stress the wrong word, like for instance, if you have the sentence like, if you say like, take the word like really. If you say the word really, like someone tells you something, they say like, oh, like, I saw a great movie today. And if you say, oh, really? Well, that can show the interest. But if you say, really? Well, now you sound really sarcastic. It's the same word, but you just changed the meaning completely. Changed it completely. Just by changing the length, changing the pitch, and changing the intonation pattern. So it's very easy to be misunderstood just by using the wrong intonation pattern. So that's why these things are really important for your speech.